The other car was gone from the lot, and when they went into the room, there was a note on Charlie's pillow written in Marla's big, loopy handwriting. "We're meeting for dinner at 6:30, and then going to you-know-where," she had written. "See you too soon. Don't forget about the rest of us. XOXO, Marla." She had drawn a smiley face and a heart below her name, and Charlie smiled to herself, folding the note and slipping it into her pocket without showing it to John. "What does it say?" he asked. "We have to meet them at the diner in—" She checked her watch. "An hour." John nodded. He was still standing in the doorway waiting for something. "What?" Charlie said. "I need to go change," he said, gesturing at the rumpled clothing he was wearing. "Can I take your car?" He held up the keys and jangled them. "Oh, yeah, of course. Just come back for me," Charlie said with a grin. He smiled. "Of course," he added with a wink. When the door closed behind him, Charlie let out a sigh. Alone at last. She was unaccustomed to so much company. She and Aunt Jen moved in their own orbits, meeting gladly from time to time throughout the day, but with the assumption that Charlie could take care of her own needs or would speak up if she could not. Charlie never spoke up. She could feed herself, get to school and back, and maintain her high grades and casual friendships. What could Aunt Jen do about nightmares, about questions she didn't really want to know the answers to? What could Aunt Jen tell her that was not even more horrific than what she already knew? So she was not used to the sustained presence of other people, and it was a little tiring. She showered quickly and pulled on new clothes, jeans and a black t-shirt, then lay back on the bed staring up at the ceiling. She had a vague sense that her mind should be racing with excitement or horror at their discoveries, going over and over the memories she'd awakened, searching for something new. Instead, she just felt blank. She wanted to be alone, to push the memories to the back of her mind where they belonged. After what seemed like only a few short minutes, there was a knock at the door, and Charlie sat up, checking her watch. More time had passed than she'd realized. It was time to leave, so she let John in. "I have to put on my shoes," she said. She looked up at him as she knotted the laces. He'd changed, this time into jeans and a t-shirt, a contrast with the formal clothes she'd gotten used to. His hair was still wet, and there was something fresh and bright about him. She smiled a little. "What?" he said when he noticed. "Nothing," she said. "You still look dirty," she joked as she pushed past him. They got in the car. This time she drove, and when they reached the diner, Charlie turned off the engine and hesitated, not moving to leave the car. "John," she said, "I don't want to tell anyone about Fredbear's." "But—" He stopped himself. "Yeah," he said, "I think we forget this is your life, and not just some adventure. It's fine. I can keep a secret." "It's all our lives," she said. "We were all there. We can tell them later. I just want to sort some of it out for myself right now." "You got it," he said, and he looked a little pleased. Charlie knew why. It was a secret between them, something she entrusted only to him. When they went inside, everyone was already halfway through dinner. Charlie realized with a sharp pang that she'd not eaten all day, and she found herself suddenly starving. The waitress spotted them as they sat down and came over immediately. They talked intermittently. Lamar, Jason, and Marla had gone to a movie, and Carlton and Jessica had played video games at his house. Their conversation was cursory, just filling the time as they ate. Charlie barely listened, and she had the feeling that even those who were talking were paying little attention to their own words. There was an agitated energy among the group. They were all just waiting, their minds already focused on Freddy's. "What about you two?" Jessica asked, looking at Charlie and John. "Yeah, what about you two?" Marla echoed with a twinkle in her eye. "We just went for a drive," John said quickly. "Got lost for a while." "I bet you did," Carlton muttered into his burger, grinning slyly even though his mouth was full. After dinner, the group hurried through the mall and toward the restaurant, hushed and cautious. As they passed through the atrium, their shoes made only soft sounds on the tiled floor, and no one spoke. Charlie had left the big flashlight in the car. They knew their way well enough by now, and the guard had almost seen them the night before. There was no reason to risk drawing extra attention. They came to the end of the hall, and Lamar, at the front of the group, stopped short. Charlie bumped into Marla before she realized what was happening, and she murmured an apology, then froze. The night guard was blocking the alley behind Freddy's, his arms folded across his chest. He had no flashlight, and so had been invisible, hidden in the darkness until they were almost upon him. "I had a feeling you wouldn't leave it alone," he said, with an odd, uneven smile. Marla whispered something unpleasant under her breath. "I could have you arrested for trespassing," he said. "Saw you here last night, but I couldn't see where you got to. I guess now I know," he added with a smirk. There was something almost immediately off-putting about the man. He was tall and slightly too thin for his uniform, which bagged at the shoulders and waist, as if he'd once been a more robust man, but had lost his form somehow to illness or tragedy. His name tag, reading Dave, hung askew on his chest. His skin was sallow, and his eyes were undercut by heavy lines, adding to the impression of long-standing ill health. "What were you all doing back here, anyway?" he demanded. "You kids partying? Drugs? I could have you arrested right now, you know." Charlie and John glanced at each other. "We're sorry," Lamar said quickly. "We'll go. We don't have any drugs." "Says who? Says you?" The guard wore an odd expression, and his words were harsh and fast. He seemed not to be responding to what they were saying. He looked angry, but his mouth kept quirking up at the corners like he was trying not to smile. "What do we do?" Jessica whispered. "Probably the most action he's ever had out here," Carlton said, with a hint of disdain. And Charlie remembered suddenly that Carlton's father was a cop. She remembered him in his uniform, tilting down his dark sunglasses at them with a mock glare, then smiling, revealing the joke. The guard, however, looked like he meant it. "We'll go," Lamar said again. "Sorry." Charlie looked at the man, considering him. The ill-fitting uniform, his peaky, almost exhausted-looking features. He really could kick them off the property or even have them arrested for trespassing. But still, she couldn't really fear him. His inadequacy shone through him like a kind of negative charisma. He would always be shoved to the back of a crowd, always shouted down in an argument, always picked last, forgotten, ignored, in favor of those who were simply more vital, more vigorously attached to life. Charlie frowned at herself. It was an unusual train of thought for her. She didn't usually assume she could read the lives of strangers through the lines on their faces, but it gave her an idea. "Why don't you come with us?" she said. "We just want to explore a little bit more, then we'll leave. You know your way around better than any of us," she added, hoping that some of the flattery would stick. "And then we'll never come back again," Carlton said. The guard did not immediately dismiss the idea, and the others quickly chimed in with their own assurances. The guard peered at them one by one, fixing his gaze on each in turn. When he looked at Charlie, she looked away, not wanting to meet his eyes, as if she'd be giving something away if she let him look too deeply. Once he had inspected them to his satisfaction, he nodded. "Sure," he said, "only because I wanted to take a walk in there myself." He jerked a thumb behind him, and catching the surprise that must have shown on their faces, added, "I'm not an idiot. I've been working here for years, walked this building inside and out every night. You think I don't know what's back there?" Charlie felt herself flush. She'd somehow assumed their discovery was unique. The guard looked down at his name tag suddenly, then pointed to it. "Name's Dave," he said. "I'm Jason," Jason said, and a little warily the others recited their own names in turn. They stood there looking at one another awkwardly for a moment, no one wanting to be the first one to move. Then Jessica shrugged. "Come on," she said. She walked quickly to the scaffolding that hid the alley to Freddy's and pulled back the plastic, revealing the break in the wall, and they all filed through, squeezing past the piled boxes. Dave hung back politely, letting them all go first. He motioned to Charlie to go ahead. "I don't want you behind me," Charlie thought. She looked at Jessica, who wasn't moving either. "Please, go ahead," Charlie said with an edge in her voice, and Dave ducked his head shyly and went. Charlie followed him, and Jessica tucked the plastic carefully back where it was, concealing their passing even though there was no one left to catch them. As they made their way down the dark alley, Charlie touched her fingers to the brick wall, dragging her hand along as if to guide her. The flashlight seemed a little dimmer now, though she knew it could only be her imagination. They led the guard to the heavy wooden shelf that hid the entrance, and Lamar, John, and Jessica dragged it out of the way, revealing the door. Charlie expected their new companion to be impressed, but he just nodded, as if he'd suspected this all along. One by one, they entered the hall of the restaurant, and again Charlie lagged back from the group. She caught Carlton by the arm as he passed her. "Carlton," she whispered, "have you ever seen this guy?" Carlton shook his head. "It's not that small a town. I don't know everybody." Charlie nodded absently, her eyes still on the newcomer, as they made their way through the long hallway into Freddy's main dining room. She'd invited the guard because it seemed like the only way to get back in, but now she was beginning to regret it. Letting a stranger into Freddy's was like letting him into her home, like giving something up. "What happened to the restaurant?" Lamar said, his tone carefully even, forcing a friendliness he could not have felt. "Why is it boarded up, and Why is the mall abandoned anyway? His voice sounded thin in the narrow hallway, a little muted. You don't know, Dave said. This town needs money, jobs, revenue, things like that. And one thing we've got a lot of is space. So they decided to build a big mall, try to attract businesses, maybe even some tourists. They built up around where Freddy Fazbear's was, but when it came to it, no one would lease the restaurant, because of what happened. So someone had the bright idea of sealing the whole place up intact. Someone who had a sentimental attachment to it, perhaps. I don't think they even tried to clear it out, but it wasn't enough. Something about that place spilled over into the rest of the building, maybe right down into the soil. No one wanted to bring their business here. Some business owners, franchisers from out of town would come look at the place, but they never signed the papers, said it just didn't feel right. I think it's got an aura, a mystical energy, maybe, if you believe in that sort of thing. Dave wiggled his fingers in the air as though casting a spell. I don't believe in that sort of thing, Lamar said shortly, but the guard didn't seem to notice his tone. To each his own, he said. All I know is no one ever wanted their stores here, and they abandoned the construction before the building was even finished. Now nobody comes up here except kids wanting to screw around. And me, he added, with what sounded like pride. He must have felt possessive, Charlie thought. The only one who ever came here for years and years. It must have felt like it belonged to him, this strange, half-finished building. To him, they must be the invaders. They came to the end of the hallway, and the space opened up before them. Jessica ran ahead to the control room beneath the stage, her flashlight bobbing merrily ahead of her. She disappeared for a moment, then hit the light switch, and all at once the room was warm and bright. Charlie stopped blinking in the sudden light. Dave brushed past her, and as he did, something caught her eye. There was a scar on his neck, curved and ugly, almost a perfect half-moon. The tissue was knotted and white. The cut that made it must have been a deep one. Only a few feet away, Dave turned in a circle, taking in the restaurant, awed, and as he did, Charlie saw that the scar had a twin, the same half-moon, in the same place on the other side of his neck. She shivered a little. The marks were too clean, too perfectly placed. They almost looked deliberate. The group fanned out. Carlton, for some reason, headed toward the kitchen, and Jason wandered away toward the arcade again. Be careful, Marla called after him, but she already was following Lamar to the control room to join Jessica. Charlie hung back, and John stayed with her. There was something different in the air, Charlie thought. It felt thinner, like she had to breathe deeper to get enough oxygen. It's just a guy, she told herself. But that was the problem. She had brought an outsider in with them, and now the restaurant felt less secure, no longer hidden away. Freddy's had been breached. Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica had begun to jerk in their stiff, single movements. Charlie looked at Dave, but he didn't appear surprised. He's been here before, she thought. Then, of course he's been here before. The whole town used to come here back then. John motioned her on, and reluctantly she went with him to the control room, Dave tagging along behind them like a stray. In the booth, Jessica was hunched over, pressing buttons, and Lamar was studying the control board, trying to make sense of it. Dave peered intently over their shoulders, watching. He was nodding slightly to himself, wrapped up in some private calculation, and when Jessica stepped back and stretched, he cleared his throat. He said. Could I try? He drew himself up a little, extending his arm graciously. Jessica and Lamar exchanged glances, then shrugged. Why not? Jessica said. They shuffled around so that he could reach the board, and he stared down at it for a long moment without moving, then touched a short series of buttons. A hum rose from the speakers, a long, low tone that did not waver. Whoa, Jessica said, and pointed to the monitors. Charlie saw movement on the screen and backed out of the control room to look for herself. On stage, the animals were dancing, crudely, awkwardly, without the grace or complexity that Charlie remembered, but they were moving in sequences, not just one motion at a time. Charlie went back to the control room, but didn't go beyond the door. How did you do that? She snapped, not caring if it was rude. Dave raised his hands in the air. Beginner's luck, he said. I just pressed some buttons. Right, Charlie said. She rubbed her temples. Can someone please turn off the speakers? Lamar darted forward and flipped a switch, and the sound died. Despite the silence, Charlie felt as if she could still hear it whining away inside her head. Charlie closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Jessica and Lamar had gone back to working the controls. but there was a caution in their movements, and they glanced at each other every few seconds as if seeking reassurance. Charlie looked at John. His arms were folded across his chest, and his eyes were trained on the back of Dave's head. In the arcade, Carlton pressed some random buttons on a game console, knowing nothing would happen, then turned around, finding himself the subject of an 11-year-old's resentful stare. "What?" he said. "I'm not a baby," Jason said. "You don't have to watch me." "What? Jason, I'm not watching you. I'm just hanging out with you. I'm not Marla. Go stick your tongue in an electric socket for all I care." He waggled his eyebrows comically, and Jason laughed. "Okay, then. Maybe I will," he said. He scanned the baseboards for a socket, briefly considering calling Carlton's bluff, but when he glanced back, Carlton had already wandered off. Jason bit his lip and rocked on his heels, feeling foolish. After a moment, he went back to the drawings on the wall. There were too many drawings to peruse each in turn, but Jason suspected he wouldn't need to. As they had the night before, the drawings would come to him. They wanted to be found. All Jason had to do was look. The drawings in the arcade gave up nothing. They were just children's grubby art faded with age. He went back out into the dining room, still hugging the walls and scanning them, hunting for something that was more than crayon. "What are you up to, Jason?" Lamar was suddenly behind him. Jason turned around and studied him for a moment, considering. He liked Lamar, even if his friendliness could be traced easily to his interest in Marla. Lamar had bent down so his head was almost level with Jason's, and Jason leaned toward him and whispered, "The drawings are moving." Lamar drew back, and for a moment a look of real alarm crossed his face, but it was fleeting. Jason bit his lip, waiting, and Lamar grinned at him, then reached out to pat him on the head. "Okay, Jason, we'll get you the help you need," he said heartily, and Jason laughed and slapped Lamar's hand away. "Shut up, seriously," Jason said, with a hint of sheepishness, and Lamar patted his head again and headed off. As soon as Lamar was a few feet away, Jason rolled his eyes. "What do you think I am, your pet?" He gave his hair a violent tussle, as if he could shake loose whatever Lamar had done to him, then went back to the wall, concentrating. He'd made his way all along one wall and was turning the corner when it happened. A flicker. Just out of the corner of his eye, almost shimmering. He stopped. Which one was it? He scanned the drawings again, going up and down the wall carefully, around the place he thought he'd seen the movement, but there was nothing. He started over, stopping to look at each crayon scribble, and then it happened again. He seized on it this time, his eye finding the drawing just as the shimmer of movement stopped, and just as he did, he saw another, so brief he would have ignored it, just a trick of the light, had he not been watching for it. It was above the first, and maybe 2 feet to the left. His eyes darted back and forth, trying to see both at once. Suddenly there was a third movement, and a drawing between the two, this one more noticeable. This time he almost saw the drawing shift before it was still again. Sitting back on his heels, Jason looked at the three drawings, each in turn. The crayon was black, and they all looked like they'd been drawn by the same kid, all with two figures in the foreground, a child and a rabbit. Jason glanced around the room. His sister and the others still seemed to be engaged by the stage. Lamar had gone back to join them. Jason pulled the drawing he had found the night before from his pocket. He smoothed it out, pressing it to the surface of the floor. Then, slowly, he peeled its linty tape out flat and stuck the paper to the wall just at his eye level. He stared at the wall, waiting. Nothing happened. Jason frowned. He'd been so certain these would tell him something, but they were just drawings. The child and the bunny stood in the middle of the paper, in one close together, in another far apart. But there was nothing there that could be called a story. Oh well. He started to look away over at the others again, and the highest one began to move. This time he saw the shift. The crayon lines twisted and slid on the page, moving of their own accord, too fast to follow. When the first stopped moving, another started. They continued one after the other until at last the one he'd just put back was finished. Jason watched, eyes wide, his heart pounding, but by the time he realized what was happening, it was over. The figures were fixed in place, and now they did tell a story. In the first, a child was sitting alone. In the second, Bonnie appeared behind the child. In the next, Bonnie had snatched the child, lifting it off the ground. In the last, the child was screaming. His eyes wide and his heart racing, Jason stepped back. He was transfixed. His body suddenly felt leaden, too heavy to run. A sound arose, like wind rustling the pages of the wall, though they hung motionless before him. The sound rushed and grew louder and louder until wind gave way to screaming. Jason clapped his hands over his ears as pages began to drop from the walls, landing with loud crashes as if they were made from something far heavier than paper. As he watched, the fallen pages turned a dark red, soaking through with color as they touched the floor. Jason turned to run, but his path was blocked as pages tumbled from the ceiling in a torrent. One landed on his shoulder, another on his back, and then another, and they clung to him, wrapping around him as if they could suffocate him. Jason felt his knees buckle under the weight, dropping at last to one knee. As he braced himself under the storm of paper, the room began to shake violently. Jason gritted his teeth, trapped, and suddenly it was over. The red-soaked papers were gone. There was nothing on his back. Marla had him by the shoulder and was staring at him wide-eyed. "Jason, what on earth is wrong with you?" Jason scrambled to his feet, brushing himself off as if he were covered with invisible insects. "The pictures were falling on me," he said urgently, still panicked. But as he looked at the wall, he realized the room was silent and still. A single picture had fallen off its place. Marla looked down at it, then back at her brother, then shook her head. She leaned close and hissed into his ear, "You embarrass me." She let loose her grip after a moment, her face almost blank, and walked away. Jason stumbled as he got to his feet, but followed as quickly as he could, keeping his eyes trained on the walls as they went. In the control room, Dave had his hands on the buttons. Excuse me. His fingers wandering lightly over them without pressing anything. The movement looked careless, instinctual, like a habit. Charlie leaned in close to John. "He's been here before," she whispered. "Look at the way he touches the controls." "Maybe he's just good with computers," John offered, not sounding convinced. "Can we make them dance again?" Jessica asked. Dave barely seemed to acknowledge the question. His mouth hung slightly open, and he seemed to be staring at something none of them could see. In the bright lights, they could all see the uniform was grubby and torn in places, his face poorly shaven, and his eyes a little unfocused. He looked less like a guard than a vagrant, and he looked at them as if he had wandered in ages ago, and they were the newcomers. It took him a moment to register the question. Sure, let's see what we can do," he said. He smiled at her, his mouth askew. His eyes were a little too intent on her face, holding her gaze just a little too long. Jessica swallowed, seized with an instinctive revulsion, but she smiled back politely. "All right," Dave said. "I've been here a few times before. I think I can work some magic." Charlie and John exchanged glances. "You've been here before," John said in a careful, even tone, but Dave ignored him or did not hear. There was a keyboard to the far left of the control board that no one had touched yet, as it didn't appear to be connected to anything. Now Dave reached for it and began to press the buttons quickly as if he'd done it 100 times before. He gave Jessica a conspiratorial glance. "For special occasions, you can request a dance." He smiled at her again with that crooked intensity. "Great," Jessica said, breathing a sigh of relief. Anything to get out of such forced proximity with this man. She looked over at Lamar. "I'm gonna go look. Will you take over?" "Yeah, sure," he said, scooting forward to fill the vacancy as Jessica and Dave made their way out to the show area. On stage, the lights were flashing in patterns, accompanying the music that no longer played, and Bonnie's mouth was moving as though in song. His eyelids closed for long blinks, then opened again without clicks, his glass eye moving from side to side. One large blue hand rose and fell, strumming exaggeratedly on the red guitar, whose strings had long since gone missing. "Lamar, how much of this are you doing?" Carlton said, suitably impressed. "Not much," Lamar called back. "Most of it seems pre-programmed." Bonnie turned to them, and Jessica startled as he seemed to look right at her. But he turned away just as quickly to face the rows of empty seats, lifting his head to sing. "It's strange seeing them like this," Jessica said, taking a step back to get a better view. Bonnie's foot tapped along in rhythm, and his mouth opened and closed with song. There was no voice, there was no music. There was only a strange humming coming from the speakers, and an orchestra of mechanical snaps and squeaks. Bonnie sped up, strumming and tapping faster. His eyes suddenly seemed out of sync, looking left while the head went right, then rolling back into his head. Dave approached the stage with deliberate steps. "Nervous little fella, aren't you?" He smiled, seemingly unbothered, as the rabbit moved faster and faster. "Hey, Lamar, can you take it down a notch?" Jessica called. Bonnie's arms began convulsing violently, his mouth open but stuttering, his eyes throwing their gaze in seemingly random directions. "Lamar, something's wrong!" Jessica cried. Bonnie's foot jerked upward with a sound like a gunshot, yanking free the bolt that anchored him to the stage. "Lamar!" Carlton climbed onto the stage and hurried to Bonnie, trying to search the rabbit for an off button as he ducked its erratic swings. "Carlton, get down, you idiot!" Jessica ran to the stage. Bonnie was moving too fast, out of control as if his program had a glitch. He was no longer following the dance sequence they all remembered so well. He began to convulse and thrash. Carlton scrambled back, trying to get away, but Bonnie's arm broke away from its guitar, swinging out, hitting Carlton in the chest, knocking him off the stage. He landed on his back and stayed down, gasping for breath. "Lamar!" Jessica shouted. "Lamar, turn it off!" "I don't know how," he yelled back. Jessica knelt down beside Carlton, looking helplessly at him. She tapped his shoulder insistently. "Carlton, are you okay? Carlton, look at me." Carlton gave a small laugh that sounded more like a cough, then grabbed her hand and pulled himself up to sit. "It's okay," he said. "Just got the wind knocked out of me." Jessica still looked worried. "I just need a minute," he assured her, the words still coming in little wheezes. In the control room, Lamar pressed button after button frantically, but on the screens he could still see Bonnie moving wildly and at random, not responding to anything he did. Charlie rushed in, pushing him out of the way, but it took her only seconds to see that the buttons were powerless. She locked eyes with Lamar for a moment. "We aren't in control," she thought. As one, they rushed from the control room to help the others. Jessica screamed, a short, high-pitched sound, and Marla and John ran to her, Charlie and Lamar arriving seconds later. All the animals were moving now in that same fitful way, cycling through their pre-programmed movements at random with a desperate, panicked air. The lights began to pulse, flickering rapidly on and off. The stage lights did the same, the colors appearing and disappearing, so that the whole space was washed first in bright gold, then a sickly green, then a bruised and vicious purple. They blinked like strobes, and the effect was nauseating. The speakers blared brief bursts of static, cutting in and out like the lights, and beneath the static was the same sound they'd heard the night before, the growling of a voice too low to be human, too indistinct to be speaking words. The group came together cautiously, not quite trusting their own senses. The lights throbbed savagely, and as Charlie walked toward her friends, she couldn't be sure how far away they were or what was right in front of her. They huddled in the middle of the floor, staring at the animals as they rattled and rocked, as if with their own agenda. Carlton got to his feet. Jessica watched him with concern, but he waved her off. "I told you I'm fine," he said, shouting to be heard over the intermittent noise. Charlie stood fixed in place, unable to take her eyes off the animals. "They're trying to get away," she thought. It was a child's thought, and she tried to dismiss it, but it clung as she watched them, scarcely noticing the fitful flickering of the lights and sound. The animatronic creatures didn't look like they were glitching. Their movement seemed not mechanical, but hysterical, like there was something they needed desperately to do, but horribly could not. "Where's Dave?" John said suddenly. Charlie met his eyes with a rising dread. Oh no. They all looked around, but the guard was nowhere in sight. "We have to find him," Charlie said. "He probably left already. Who cares?" Marla said, her voice high and frightened. "I'm not worried about him," she said grimly. She turned to John. "Come on," she said, setting off toward the hallway to the right of the stage. He glanced at the rest of the group over his shoulder, then followed Charlie at a brisk pace. "We should find the other control room and see if we can stop all this from there," Jessica said crisply, taking charge. "You and Jason go look for Dave," she told Marla. "I'll go with them," Lamar said quickly. "Control room," Carlton said, looking at Jessica. "Control room," she confirmed. They all set off, moving slowly. The strobing lights distorted the space in front of them, seeming to throw up obstacles that weren't there, obscuring the ones that were. The effect was disorienting, a constantly shifting maze of light and noise. "Ow!" Marla shouted, and everyone stopped short. "Are you okay?" Carlton yelled. "Yeah, I just bumped into this stupid merry-go-round," she called back. The speakers were momentarily noiseless, but they shouted across the small distance as if there were a canyon between them. In another hallway, Dave was moving toward a goal. Without the others there to watch, he moved fast, scuttling almost sideways and darting his eyes back over his hunched shoulders from time to see that he wasn't followed. There was a large key ring at the belt of his uniform, but only a few keys hung from it. He selected one, opened a door, and let himself into the restaurant's office. He closed the door quickly behind him, cushioning it against noise, even though the group would never hear it this far away or note it between their own shouts and the blaring of the speakers. He turned on the overhead light. It was steady, illuminating the room without a flicker. On the far wall, there was a tall closet flat against the wall, and he used another key on his ring to open it. Dave stood still in the open door for a long moment, breathing deeply. As he did, his back straightened and his hollow chest seemed to expand, drawing an uncharacteristic confidence from what he saw. An odd, thin smile on his lips. Dave reached out with his fingertips, savoring the moment, and brushed yellow fur. Jessica and Carlton hurried away down the hall toward the second control room, but Marla and the two boys moved more slowly, sticking their heads into the party rooms, then the arcade. The rooms appeared empty, but in the constantly changing light, Jason thought as they moved on, it would be easy to miss about anything. Having checked the area, Marla and Lamar headed back into the main room. "Where are Jessica and Carlton?" Lamar shouted over another burst of garbled sound. Jason stopped and looked back, and in a fleeting instant, he saw it. A rabbit, outlined in the hall for a split second as the lights flashed on him, then vanishing and appearing again in his place in the party room they had just left. "Marla!" Jason shouted. "Marla!" His voice was shrill, agitated. She whirled around. "What? Are you okay?" "I saw Bonnie! He was there!" "What?" Marla's eyes went automatically to the stage. Bonnie was still there, moving back and forth in the same odd, spastic movements. "Jason, look, he's there. He can't move off the stage." Jason looked. Bonnie was there. "I saw him," he thought, looking back down the hallway, but it was empty. Jessica came running up, out of breath. "Is everyone okay? I heard screaming." "We're fine," Lamar said. Jason thought he saw something. "Where's Carlton?" Marla said. She rubbed her temples. "Oh, this light's giving me such a headache." "He's still fighting with the controls," Jessica said. "We should find Charlie and John. I think we need to get out of here." "I think they went that way," Lamar said, pointing to the hall at the far end of the room just past the stage. "Come on," Jessica said. Jason followed as the group crossed the main dining room again, maneuvering cautiously around tables and chairs. He looked back as they reached the hall. Suddenly, Bonnie appeared again, darting out of the arcade, ducking into the hall that led to Pirate's Cove. Jason watched his sisters and the other file through the doorway, then slipped away before they could see him go. He ran across the room, intent on following the rabbit, then slowed his pace when he reached the dark hallway. The lights in the little hall were completely out, and though he could see nothing, it was a minor relief from the pulsing strobes. Jason hugged the wall as he moved, trying to scan ahead of him for signs of movement, but it was too dark. His eyes had not adjusted. After what seemed like ages, he came out of the hall and into Pirate's Cove. From a distance, he could hear his sister's voice calling his name. "Guess they noticed I'm gone," he thought wryly. He ignored it. Crossing the room, he peered down the other hallway, the one that led to more party rooms, but it was so dark that he could scarcely see more than a few feet ahead. Turning back, he approached the little stage, the out-of-order sign still strung across it. As if anything in this place is in order. Suddenly, the curtain moved, and Jason froze. The curtain began pulling back. Jason couldn't bring himself to run. All went dark, and then the lights came on suddenly to reveal Carlton standing in front of him, having emerged from behind the curtain. "What are you doing back here by yourself? Come on, let's go." Carlton greeted him with a warm smile. Awash with relief, Jason took a step forward, opening his mouth to speak, and stiffened, struck still with fear. Bonnie suddenly broke through the darkness, appearing beneath the stage lights before them. But it wasn't Bonnie. This rabbit's yellow fur was almost blinding in the light. He rushed at them, and before Jason could cry out, the giant rabbit had a hold of Carlton from behind, smothering his face with a giant matted paw and wrapping his other great arm around Carlton's chest, gripping tightly. Carlton struggled silently, hitting and kicking, but the creature barely seemed to notice. He screamed into the rabbit's paw, but the sound was swallowed whole. As he fought, the rabbit slunk back the way he came, dragging Carlton with him like a prize from the hunt. Jason watched them go, agape. His heart raced and his breath was shallow. The stifling air around him made him lightheaded. A noise came from behind him, the grinding screech of rusted metal beginning to move, and he leaped forward and turned, moving just in time to avoid a hook as it plunged swiftly downward. Foxy's eyes flashed in synchrony with the lights above, and for a dizzying moment, it seemed to Jason that those eyes were the controlling force behind it all, that if Foxy closed his eyes, every light might go out. The animal didn't move like the others. It slowly, purposefully rose between the gap in the curtains, its gleaming eyes reaching a staggering height. "Jason!" It was Charlie's voice, he knew, but he kept staring back and forth, first at Foxy, then at the place where Carlton had been stolen away. "Jason!" she called again, and then she and John were beside him, touching him, shaking him out of his ghastly reverie. John grabbed his hand and pulled him into a run. In the main room, the others were already halfway down the hallway to the outside door, all but Marla, who was waiting anxiously at the entrance, her face flooding with relief when she saw Jason. "Marla! Bonnie took Carlton!" Jason yelled, but she just put a hand on his back and pushed him through the door and into the hall. "Go, Jason!" "But I saw Bonnie take Carlton!" he cried, but he ran, afraid to stop. They ran down the hall to the outside door, all bouncing with a frightened impatience as they filed through the alley one by one. There was no way to go faster. When they were all through, Charlie looked down the hallway for a long moment, but there was no one coming. She shoved the door closed and stepped out of the way as Lamar and Jason wrestled the shelf back into place, blocking it off. "No one saw Dave," Charlie said. It was not a question. They all shook their heads. "He must have taken off when the lights started going haywire," Lamar offered, but he didn't sound convinced. "Carlton!" Jason cried out again. "Carlton is still in there! Bonnie took him!" They all glanced around. Carlton was not with them. "Oh no," Jessica said. "He's still inside." "Bonnie took him," Jason said, choking out the words one by one, his voice shaking. "I saw it. Bonnie was there. He was in Pirate's Cove, and he grabbed Carlton and carried him away. I couldn't stop him." He scrubbed a sleeve across his eyes, wiping tears. "Oh, sweetheart," Marla hugged him, and he clung to her, hiding his face in her shirt. "No, it was a trick of the light. Bonnie couldn't do that. He's just a robot. He was on stage when we left." Jason closed his eyes. He'd only glanced for a second at the main stage as they were leaving, but it was true. Bonnie had been there, moving in strange and clumsy twists and bends, stuck in place. He pulled away from his sister's arms. "I saw it," he insisted more weakly. "Bonnie took him." The others exchanged glances above his head. Charlie looked at Marla, who shrugged. "We have to go back in," Charlie said. "We have to get him." Jessica was nodding, but John cleared his throat. "I think we need help," he said. "It's not safe in there." "Let's get Carlton's dad," Marla said. "I'm not taking Jason back in there." Charlie wanted to protest, but she bit her tongue. They were right. Of course they were right. Whatever had just happened was beyond them. They needed help. You got me running in a circle.